Welcome, everybody, to this early March session of our global talks. Those who don't know, we're Congressman Chairman, Director of the Center for Global Studies. And let me start our session today by reminding that the acknowledgement and respect of the long songs and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Klingon and Masonic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And I think we will hear a little bit about colonial legacies and communities that have been exposed to systematic exclusion or discrimination in this talk today as well. With this, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Sophia Carodenuto, who most all of you know by now. He was currently a fellow at the center, and also she's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, where she also leads the environmental governance group. And you could tell already from her title and what you might have heard about her research, what she's interested in thinking about the governance of natural resources and how this impacts communities that are involved in this practice, how it informs public policies from a political economy perspective, looking at environmental justice issues. And what makes her research very special and I think very engaged is her commitment to working with communities on the ground, thinking about how practices in dealing with natural resources, how this impacts the lives of particular communities and individuals, and what you can tell about this through a place-based approach. And if you look at where Sophia has done field research, my academic life seems very boring. She has been the true global existence in terms of the places she has been engaged in and worked with communities in, as you can see, Ethiopia, Suriname, Fiji, Ghana, Argentina. But mostly likely, I think you're focused on cocoa production, Congo, Cameroon, these countries. So we are very excited to hear more about the research and the wonderful impact it has on the community cities. So Sophia, late welcome to the center. You've been around for a little while now, and we are very excited here.
Thank you, and it's been so wonderful to be here in the CFGS community. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to do the fellowship. So I just want to start off with that mention of gratitude. It's been really great, and I'm already sad that it's only coming to an end.
You can never leave this.
Yeah,
so don't worry about it.
No, yeah. So today I'm going to present some relatively new research. Most of my work has focused on the production side of cocoa, but also other commodities. So here you see me in Cameroon. I got interested in this topic in around 2010 when I visited Cameroon for the first time. And here you see me witnessing one of the first stages of the cocoa supply chain, where beans are put out under the sun to dry. So these are the types of beans that would likely come into the chocolate that we don't know the origin of. So it's only recently that I focused more on the consumption side. And so I'm really excited to hear from all of you that probably have more experience from the Canadian policy landscape. And so I'm really excited to get some feedback on some really preliminary research on Canada's regulatory approach to this problem. So I know that here at the CFGS, we're all working on very different topics. So I just want to take some time at the beginning to situate the problem in general that my research is addressing. And so that's this global problem of tropical deforestation and the fact that there is a regulatory gap globally to address that. So here we see forest loss, or specifically tree cover loss, since 2001. And the green layer is primary tropical forests that are still standing. So all of the purple layer is tropical deforestation loss. Of course, we also see some loss in the global north or in the northern hemisphere. So we're only seeing the primary risk layer in the tropics. So forest loss is not only happening in the tropics, it's also happening in Canada or in Europe, but we're seeing in Europe, actually, there's a net gain in forest cover. This is because Europe has lost most of its forests already during the Industrial Revolution. But why are we primarily interested in tropical forests? Not only because there's still a significant part remaining, but it's also a biodiversity hotspot where there's many species that can only live and thrive in those areas. It's also of significant cultural importance to many people that live in those areas, and not to mention an important thing or an important stock of carbon. So from a global climate change perspective, many say that the Amazon and the Congo Basin are the left lungs of the world, helping us to change all of that CO2 emissions to the beautiful oxygen that we're breathing. So just to give a little bit of perspective, it's sometimes hard to see those numbers. You know, the size of Croatia in 2022 was lost. So since 2016, we've actually seen an uptick in tropical deforestation for the first time in 2022. And so to give a little bit of perspective from a climate change perspective, if tropical tree cover loss were a country, it would rank third in global emissions. And so this figure is a little outdated from 2016. If we were to click on something, if we were to update this to just, I mean, the numbers for 2023 aren't really out yet. So for 2022, the equivalent of the carbon dioxide emissions from deforestation, tropical deforestation, is equivalent to India's annual fossil fuel emissions. So it's a very significant problem that if we're wanting to tackle climate change, and many of you are working on that, it's one of the major issues that we need to keep in mind. So what is causing this tropical forest loss? I'm sure many of you already know, but it's agriculture, and most importantly, tropical forest risk commodities. Here we see a few examples. So we're looking at cattle and soy and palm in Brazil, for example. We're looking at cocoa in Ghana and the Ivory Coast. We're looking at palm in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia. These are major drivers of deforestation. So just to unpack this a little bit more from a food systems perspective, because when you're looking at climate change emissions, the accounting frameworks like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and even Canada's climate accounting framework, we don't have food as a category, right? We have industrial emissions, we have energy emissions, we do have land and agriculture, but not necessarily food, because food goes beyond that. So I just want to use this to signify the importance in that many studies estimate that up to 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from food. So I just had to keep this in here. I usually do this when I'm teaching, but I like to ask my students, where are emissions from the food sector concentrated? If we look at this supply chain, where are the majority of greenhouse gas emissions concentrated? Is it at the farm level? Is it in the supply chain? Is it in packaging? Is it in processing? Is it consumption? Is it food waste maybe? What do you guys think? Where are the majority of emissions concentrated?
I think supply chain.
Do you think supply chain? What do you guys, any other ideas? Yeah.
I think we got farm.
Farm, great.
So cattle farming especially, right?
Cattle farm, yeah, so what about cattle farming?
Like it's the emission of the, I'm not sure how.
Methane.
Yeah, it's a methane emissions basically.
Yeah, so excellent. I'm so glad that we went from supply chain to land use change, because what is it about cattle farming that's most important? It's the conversion of forest land to agriculture land. But of course, there's also a lot of emissions in the agriculture production, right? So how are you tilling, what chemicals are you using on the farm? So you're very right that farm-based emissions are very important. So taking those two together, land use change, which doesn't always occur, but very often does, especially in the tropical forest with commodity context. But then the farm-based emissions are most important. And so Hannah Ritchie is this great data scientist based in Oxford who wrote a book, I'm blanking on the name, but it's a book about optimism, especially in the context of climate change. And she says, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint of food, focus on what you're eating and how it's produced, not necessarily where it's coming from. Because the transport emissions are minuscule, right? That especially compared to the other end of the supply chain, the production side. So here's just a little bit of more representation of that, how we have land use and production of agriculture products where the majority of emissions are concentrated. The supply chain is really small compared to that. And so just to finalize this motivation of my research with a bit about carbon accounting, I'm sure many of you have heard about this idea of scopes of emissions. So you can think about emission scopes from an individual perspective, but it's generally applied to corporations or firms. So what are the three scopes of emissions that corporations have? Scope 1 emissions, the shorthand is burn. This is what happens within the complex or within the industrial headquarters or the actual building where the firm is located. What energy is burned there? What is specifically happening in that facility, vicinity? Scope 2 emissions are generally referred to as VI. This is the energy that is produced elsewhere but consumed by the firm. So these are scope 2 emissions. It's basically the electricity bills or the energy bills of the company. So we're starting to move from direct emissions that are the scope 1 to indirect emissions with energy consumption. But what we're most interested in, or what I'm most interested in my research, is the scope 3 because it's everything else. And scope 3 is where by far the majority of emissions are concentrated. And especially for food, for the food industry, up to some estimates even say for some of the coffee companies we're looking at for our research, 99% of their emissions are scope 3. And so scope 3 is upstream activities, what is happening post-production, or excuse me, what is happening prior to production, where are the goods coming from and how are they produced? Who are the suppliers of a company's business? And then the downstream is more the consumption activities and life cycle analysis, including waste. All right, so tropical deforestation, I'm going to continue with this first research project to explain about this regulatory gap, especially at the global level. So this is based on some research that I've been doing really since my master's research when I was living in Cameroon. So it's been a paper that has been in process for literally decades, or at least 1 decade. So dating myself here. So I'm really excited it's finally gone out, and we're focusing on the EU. What has the EU done to address scope 3 emissions? Right, considering that we all know the EU now has net forest gain. So deforestation is not an issue within their own jurisdiction, but the EU has recognized that a lot of their emissions are happening elsewhere, and they are importing deforestation through their food consumption. And there's been these beautiful studies. I didn't include all the references here, but you can always follow up with me. There's been these beautiful scientific and NGO research-driven studies that are giving us these estimates of how much the EU is contributing to global deforestation. And we even have this per capita estimate that the EU has one of the biggest importers of illegally harvested or illegally illegal deforestation that results from agriculture in other countries. I'm not aware of similar studies happening in Canada. If anybody knows of these kinds of studies that estimate how much is a Canadian consumer contributing to global emissions through its food consumption or even any kind of consumption, even if it's beyond food. So the EU has really done a lot, and this has put this idea of tropical deforestation on the political agenda. And so the EU has been really a leader in addressing deforestation that is embodied or embedded in imports. And they passed this so-called EU deforestation regulation that requires corporations exercise due diligence, which means that corporations have to now be responsible for the deforestation of their embedded in their supply chain. So of course, a company that is importing coffee in Europe doesn't necessarily know what's happening on the coffee farm, but now they have to know. Now they have to go and find out and assess if there's any risk that that coffee production has caused deforestation, and they are responsible for that. If the first importer to the EU is responsible. So this is really groundbreaking in many ways. This is one of the first instances. There's been France and Germany have similar legislation, mandatory due diligence legislation for corporations, but it's kind of all coming out of this same EU process, which is this transition from soft law to hard law, which means in the past, corporations that have global supply chains are generally, they're doing something to make their supply chains more sustainable. We all have heard about CSR, corporate social responsibility. So corporations are doing a lot of voluntary corporate social responsibility, voluntary measures to address the deforestation in their supply chain. But now, with this new regulation, it has become hard law, and companies are now obliged to exercise due diligence and know what's happening in their supply chain, take responsibility for that. So there's right now a huge scramble in the EU. Their companies are actually really worried. This was just passed last year, so beginning at the end of this year, companies have to produce these due diligence reports for each import. And it's a major game changer for companies. It's really revolutionary, but at the same time, there's a lot of backlash from companies that are exporting, saying, you know, this is a new form of imperialism. You know, what is the EU doing about regulating what happens to our forests and our land? Because globally, forests are, there's no global forest convention. I'm going to get to this in a minute, but countries have the sovereign authority to decide what happens with their own forests, basically, what happens with their own agriculture sectors. So is this imperialism or you know, the new form of sustainability? What my paper does is looks at how, sorry, that should be a T. What my paper does is actually look at how this isn't actually anything very new. And it's funny how there's all this hype about the EU deforestation regulation, because we just had the EU timber regulation that has now been subsumed into the EU DR. So the research that I've been doing for my master's and PhD was on the timber regulation. And it's really funny that, you know, it's really not the first time that something like this has happened. But because it's so broad in scope, there's now 7 commodities that are being regulated by the EUDR, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, cattle, beef, and wood or timber. So it's now much broader, but there's a lot that we can learn from the experience of the timber regulation. And one of the key things that we can learn is the challenge of a consumer jurisdiction like the EU trying to regulate or govern land use decisions in a jurisdiction outside. So we use this idea of Europeanization, and normally Europeanization is meant for, you know, the immediate countries in the broader EU, like the presentation that we just had last week, right? Like Serbia is wanting to access the EU. So external Europeanization refers to what's happening even beyond the scope of that pan-European continental process of Europeanization. And we're looking at what's happening in Africa. How is the EUTR or the EUDR kind of a symbolic of other countries having to take on the norms and ways of doing things and governance processes that the EU wants, right? So we looked at Cameroon and Ghana, and we looked at, this is the theory now of there's different ways that the EU can export basically its own rules and norms and customs. Coercion, legal coercion, excuse me, which is what we're seeing in these regulations, right? So now, if companies or if countries want to continue exporting their agriculture commodities to the EU, they have to prove that it's deforestation free. So it's a legal requirement. There's actually no choice. Conditionality, this usually relates to markets. So the EU using its significant consumer presence in the world saying, well, not only do we have a lot of consumers, but they're generally interested in more niche products that meet sustainability standards, right? We're more interested in paying higher premiums for products that are sustainable. And then there's socialization, which is kind of ways of doing things or customs that are exported through this process. And finally, persuasion, this is the diplomatic process. This is most important in external Europeanization, where markets and law traditionally haven't had as much of influence. So using processes of persuasion are more important there. So we applied this framework using process tracing, and we collected a lot of data over a long period of time. Cameroon and Ghana were some of the first countries to start implementing the European Union timber regulations. So we have a long time period that we're looking at. And basically what we were able to trace is the failure of the EUTR, that it was not possible for the European Union to exercise extrajudicial governance of forest decisions in Cameroon and Ghana. They tried, and they implemented a lot of technical systems to trace timber and verify the legality of timber through the supply chain. But in the end, the ultimate aim of creating legality certificates, allowing an exporter to reach EU markets, were never obtained. It was never successful. And so here we see that at the beginning, there was all this, oh, I can't actually point on that, but there's Europeanization is a very fascinating framework that has many components. They have a lot of scope conditions that allow for explaining what's happening, but here we see these outcomes on the vertical axis here, where retrenchment and inertia is the outcome in the end for Cameroon and Ghana. So interestingly, what we found is that rather than the Europeanization process going from Europe to Cameroon and Ghana, it actually went the other way. And towards the end, Cameroon and Ghana were able to change the outcome really of this regulation, and in many fascinating political ways. So I just want to end this project by mentioning this idea of the Brussels effect, which maybe some of you have also heard of, but it's this idea of the EU becoming this global regulator, that if the EU does something, it kind of has this ripple effect around the world. And the EU was really on this quest to save the world's forests, especially tropical forests. And so I'm really curious to see if there will be a Brussels effect in Canada. And this leads me to the second project, where I'm curious about the Canadian context and whether we might have a similar regulation here. This is a project that I'm doing with many people, Michaela and Sarah. It's a very much a team-based project. We're working with the lab that I'm a part of, the environmental governance group based in the geography department. So I just want to do a shout out to all of these amazing people, especially Rachel Friedman, who's a Banting postdoc now on mat leave, but she's been a lead here. So here, and this Sarah made this beautiful graph. Here we see a timeline of Canada's due diligence history. And we can trace it all the way back to 1999, where we have the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Over time, we've seen a series of instances with Canadian regulators trying to do something about especially the extractives industry. So here in Canada, the international mining industry has a very, very bad reputation. If I have time, I have this anecdote from I teach a course. It's a regional studies course on Africa, and I had actually Côte d'Ivoire's first Ivoirian chocolate maker. Côte d'Ivoire is the #1 exporter of cocoa beans, but they do not export any chocolate. And this guy came, Hector Emmanuel, we met him in our lab. He came last year, and I asked him, because we were talking a lot in my class about stereotypes and the stereotypes that we all have of Africa, right? And we often refer to it as if it were a country rather than a continent, but so I asked him, what is his stereotype of Canadians? Because it might be nice to have that exchange, you know? And he actually said, oh, the mining atrocities, the human rights atrocities. Everyone thinks of that when they hear Canada. So I think getting that African perspective was really eye-opening for me, but also a lot of students, recognizing that, yeah, Canada really does have a bad reputation. But not so much in the food industry, you know, and we are importing a lot of foods that simply cannot be produced in Canada. Coffee, tea, chocolate, right? It's impossible to grow that here. There are some labs in California that are trying to create a synthetic chocolate, but I've heard it tastes very bad. So what's exciting is that just last year, we had Bill S-211, which is colloquially known as the Modern Slavery Act, and this it kind of replicates what happened in the UK, where for the first time businesses are starting to be held accountable for any human rights abuses in their supply chain, right? So it's really focused on human rights, labor rights, and so on. And there was this proposal, Bill C-262, that was desired. It hasn't actually passed. And it didn't make it past the first round, but this would move more towards a due diligence requirement for Canadian corporations. So unfortunately, we don't have that, but there's movement, there is advocacy looking at that. So the research that we're doing, we've honed in to only look at coffee importers. So we have a database that covers 80% of Canada's coffee imports. And we're looking at what were to happen if we were to have a due diligence regulation like C-262 pass tomorrow. What are companies doing already? And so we created this analytical framework to look at what companies are committing themselves to. And what I find really interesting about the Canadian approach, and this is, you know, happening other places as well, but the Bill 211 is very much focused on corporate reporting. That there is a requirement to produce certain documents. And there's a lot of literature about, you know, the limitations of that approach. Basically, we're moving from voluntary corporate reporting to mandatory corporate reporting, but does it really change anything? What is the due diligence mechanism? Who is actually going in to see if companies are doing what they say they're doing in their reports, right? That's the next stage, which unfortunately we're not able to do with our research, but we're looking at, okay, what is the content of these reports? So we look at public-facing corporate commitments. This is interesting for transparency purposes. If any of us can access this information, any of us can start looking at, you know, is this really happening? We try to categorize the publicly available commitments into strength. Is this commitment just something the company is saying, or is there some type of third-party verification backing that up? If there is some audit or third-party looking into this as well, then we gave it a stronger rating. And then we're also looking at some company level variables related to, is this company Canadian? Is this company international? Are they only trading coffee? Are they trading other commodities? How many employees do they have? All of that to try to understand, you know, what is influencing certain companies to have stronger commitments versus others. So this is not the full range of companies that we looked at, but the very preliminary findings. So please no pictures of this slide. But we're really trying to disentangle what's happening. There's a lot of international companies that are importing to Canada. And of course, no surprise that the international large companies, many of which are trading other commodities beyond coffee, have stronger commitments. And so we're trying to move towards, and you know, there's not so much time, so I can't go into the details, but we're trying to move towards analyzing this in a way that can inform the policy, right? Is it surprising that Bill C-262 did not pass, considering what we're seeing about how Canadian companies aren't actually prepared? If this were to pass tomorrow, the international corporations would fare much better than the Canadian corporations. So maybe there's something to be said there about why we're not seeing this political uptake for regulating companies with a due diligence policy. So a few preliminary implications here. Another thing that we're seeing in the law or in the proposals for different types of bills is that Canada really has this focus on human rights. And I don't know if it's stemming from the Truth and Reconciliation process that's happening domestically, but the environment, you know, the putting something like tropical deforestation on the agenda is just not where it's at in other jurisdictions. And maybe it's because of the forest industry here. I'm not sure, but there's really not been so much movement on the environmental side. We also have this interesting cycle. Yeah, I think the lobbying might be a good place to start, but we have this interesting cycle in the policymaking process, the interaction between public and private sustainability governance. You know, we see a lot of reporting already happening. I mean, it's quite heterogeneous, but there's a fair amount of number 3, strong commitments when it comes to corporate reporting. So are we regulating what companies are already doing? Right? Or are companies trying to set themselves up to inform policy in a way to get regulators to say, oh, you know, if you produce these reports, then you'll be fine. So it's this interesting, I think there's this feedback loop that will be really interesting to disentangle. Right. So how am I doing on time? I have no idea.
Yeah, he's good.
Okay, so this last project is something that I've been working on with Claire for actually a fair while now. Yeah, we need to get moving on that manuscript. So this is from Insight Development Grant, where I was looking specifically at, or we were looking specifically at smallholder farmers and the contracts that they had in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, and why these two countries, I think you can see for yourself. Côte d'Ivoire, people don't know about the country, maybe it's because it's so francophone. It really, you know, there's.
No, I'm just,
Oh, okay.
I think you're totally right, because Francophone would actually know that way better than that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
I was just in Belize working with cocoa farmers who trade and process cocoa as their livelihood, and they were all telling me that Ghana is the #1 producer, right? So it's like, what happened with Côte d'Ivoire? They're almost at 50% of the global supply of cocoa. I mean, this fluctuates, right? Some years it's 46%. What's happening right now with the crazy prices, I don't know if you followed, but the price of cocoa on the global market has like tripled in the last few months. This is because Côte d'Ivoire has a 30% decrease this year in output due mainly to climate change, also different diseases. So I get all these reporters asking me to comment on how the cocoa price is gonna affect Canadian chocolate industry. I'm like, well, that's not really my area of research, but I can talk about cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire if you want. So cocoa is huge in Côte d'Ivoire. It's also huge in Ghana, but you can imagine just the magnitude, how much cocoa is being moved through this country is crazy. And so here we see the impacts, the environmental impacts. And what's really surprising is this only goes to 2015. Côte d'Ivoire has experienced some of the highest deforestation rate increase in recent years, like 2018 to 2019, 2021 to 2022. So the small fragments of forest remaining are still being lost at a very rapid rate, due mainly to cocoa. So there's a lot that can be said about the social equity implications of that. And Côte d'Ivoire has actually had a bit of a bad reputation for using brute force and sending the police into protected areas that are being encroached upon. And farmer livelihoods are obviously second priority, but Côte d'Ivoire wants to maintain its reputation as the #1 exporter and not have people worry about the deforestation embedded there. So in this research, we're taking a supply chain approach and trying to ask, where are supply chain commitments lost in translation, right? We're seeing all these beautiful corporate commitments. We will be deforestation free by 2025. full transparency by 2025, deforestation continues. If anything, it's increasing. So we really focus on the farmer. And I wish this said farmer's voice because we're interested in the agency of the farmer and from a contractual perspective. And we're taking a contractual governance perspective that includes informal contracts as well. So focusing on the so-called first mile, what is the relationship between the farmer and the first point of contact in the supply chain? And it's not these global corporations, right? It's either a local cooperative or even smaller than that, the délégué. Or in Côte d'Ivoire, there's this informal trader that has a very bad reputation. Pisteur is what they're called. In Ghana, it's more regulated, but just to talk a little bit about the results, I wanna use this egg timer, this hourglass shape to describe the value chain. If you tilt that hourglass and overlay it with the supply chain, with upstream here on your left and downstream here on your right, we see that there's many farmers, many cocoa farmers upstream, thousands of retailers downstream, but here in the middle, there's 3 companies that trade 60% of the world's cocoa. Barry Callebaut, Cargill, Olam. Cargill is headquartered just down the street from where I grew up in Minnesota, so it's really fascinating for me to try to access them somehow through like local neighborhood connections, but it's very hard. And so we're really interested in this area of the supply chain where there's surprisingly little knowledge about what happens between this middle tiny waist of the hourglass and the farmer. How are these farmers' desires being incorporated? And what is the role of these informal traders to support agency of farmers, right? When the EU passes this legislation, actually the cocoa sector is going to be the most affected by the EU deforestation regulation because the EU imports about 60% of the world's cocoa. So we'll see if there will be a diversion to Asian markets as a result. Probably not, just given the infrastructure that Amsterdam and Munich have for processing cocoa into some of the first forms of chocolate. But what do farmers think about this, right? Somebody coming in and saying, you can't remove that tree, actually. What are you doing on your farm, right? So it's considered quite invasive by many people. And so we're looking at how contracts might be a form of governing sustainability and how that is passed from these downstream companies who are making sustainability commitments all the way to the farmer. And the reality is, this is a simple depiction of the supply chain. The reality is it's extremely complex, and we have many more nodes in the supply chain. And so here we have in the brown, the informal supply chain, which is also called indirect supply chain. And the formal supply chain goes through cooperatives. And when you look at the cocoa industry and chocolate industry's corporate commitments, almost all of them are referring to their direct supply chain. You really have to know what you're looking for, but if you're looking for it, you'll see that they're almost all only referring to their direct supply chain that has clear cooperatives, some beautiful sustainability programs for those cooperatives, but what we see on the ground is there's a lot of fluidity between this informal and formal sector. And so when companies like Cargill or Barry Callebaut say, you know, we have full traceability of our direct supply chain, we have deforestation-free direct supply chain, it's really hard to believe that because locally, you know, your neighbor who's also a cocoa farmer will say, hey, you're getting a higher price through that cooperative. I want to get a premium too. Hey, why don't you take some of my beans and sell them to the cooperative? That happens all the time. And so, you know, it's very hard to regulate that. But what we're finding, what we found through our data, we conducted a lot of interviews with these informal traders, but also with the farmers themselves. Farmers prefer the informal supply chain. Why? Because they're paid immediately and they're paid in cash. The cooperatives are not able to always do that. And so if the EU deforestation regulation is going to formalize what has been an informal sector, there's a good chance that the farmers, the most marginalized actors, will be left out, will be even further marginalized as a result of this. Okay, so now this last tasting is highlighted. Are there any questions before I move into this, or what do you guys think?
Before we go to the tasting?
Yeah, before we go to the tasting,
Yeah, no, let's maybe interrupt here. We really do want a fascinating presentation, so it's, you know, very timely and
Yeah, while we were speaking, I was reminded why we were so enthusiastic about having you as a fellow here, because, you know, if you think about what the center tries to do, the network between the global and the local practices, the policy of the game, all these kind of things are wonderful to hear and get a window into your very rich research agenda. But I could see that Ted was quite enthusiastic. So you look like that.
A simple factual question.
yeah.
Under the existing timber regulation, which I assume much of the administrative structure will be moved forward to the new government, who actually prepared the due diligence reports? I assume there's a consulting sector that cropped up in between that specializes in doing that. Have there ever been any occasions of those reports actually reporting that there was a failure of the standard, and what happens then?
Yeah, thank you. So, yes. I think that's an excellent area for research, and with my consulting background, I worked for about 8 years for a consulting firm in Germany, and I know how this works. The EUDR is a boom for European consultants. And it's the thing, yeah, it's the thing with the timber regulation, where they are obsessed with the technological approach. If we can produce polygons that show, so, you know, the spatial geomatics experts are having a heyday, right? Producing these polygons of where production is happening. So right now, that's the first step. The due diligence report mainly is comprised of these polygons. It was interesting in Belize, the cocoa trading company that I was working with there, they were so excited that they have their polygons and they submitted their polygons and they were approved. So, right now, the EUDR hasn't actually gone into force yet, so there hasn't been any failures yet. It's been passed. Everyone has to work on their reports right now because the cocoa that they're buying now isn't going to be imported until, you know, it's forward contracts usually. So the cocoa they're buying now is going to be imported when the regulation is in full force, but we haven't seen whether that's happened yet. But yeah, it's a crazy technology-driven approach and using mostly geospatial data, which is, you know, very easy to manipulate, right? I mean, anyway. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Almost. So approved means the consultant made a determination that given these data, this producer was deemed deforestation free. And that allowed any European buyer to buy timber that originated with this producer. Is that
So it's, the burden is on the first importer, which is usually a corporation. So technically, it's the corporation that, or the importer, that will be producing that report. But they will most likely be subcontracting that. So, but at the end of the day, you know, it's their official document that they're submitting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Claire was next, or did I overlook anyone? So, no, I tried to get.
Thank you, Sophia, that was really great. The overview of all your research. I just have one observation and then one question. When you were saying how the Canadian focus seems to be much more on human rights than on the environment, I think one thing that I would look at there, and this would be a whole thesis, and you know, why this, but I think huge influence in global affairs has been the UN Global Compact focus on the framework of business and human rights, not business and the environment, you know, Ruggies' whole
Oh,
initiative.
right,
And
yeah,
that was kind of imported into global affairs
yeah,
and it influences trade and investment policies in
Yeah.
Ottawa. So that is, I
Yeah.
think, one of the reasons why, and then I think on the other side is the power of the minerals that in extractive industries in Canada. They're just very, very powerful. So I mean, that would be the other side. So I think that would be a good place to look. And actually, David Lark, who used to be a fellow here, now works in global affairs. And in Ottawa, he might be somebody you'd want to touch base with. He's a PhD student of mine. Anyway, he was telling me about this focus that you just can't, I'm writing a book on why we can't get the environment on the agendas. And he was saying you just can't seem to dislodge this focus on human rights. It's just really endemic. So just one comment there. And then just a question back to when you were talking about the failure of the process of the EU TR. And then you said that in the end, it was almost as though the countries, the African countries, were able to change the policy, the European policy. So could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
How, you know, what happened to the fines that were supposed to go out, or did they just stop the process, or?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's fascinating to look at it that way. Well, basically what happened is, building on Ted's comment, there was a whole decade of different consultants coming in trying to build this traceability system, highly technical, you know, based on barcodes. You need internet access all the time, which is just not available, you know, so it was just not really built for the context. And then in the end, the EU wanted to have the code for the latest round of this timber tracing technological system. And I mean, this is the case of Cameroon. The Cameroon said, no, we're not going to give you this underlying code. You have to just believe us, right? That when we produce a legality certificate for whatever timber is exported from our country, it's good enough, right? And then the EU was like, no, we don't really buy that. And so in the end, there was kind of this standoff. But another thing that happened, I mean, specifically with this reverse Europeanization, what happened is that Ghana and Cameroon have a very large informal timber market. And so when the government was realizing, okay, there's a lot of lost revenue in this informal domestic market. Like, not all of our timber is exported, a lot of it is moving regionally as well, but that's all very, it's regulated in a very informal way, right? So there's checkpoints, police will say, hey, you know, what timber, where does this come from? Give me some money, and you know, so on. So the government is looking for ways to increase tax revenue. And they kind of saw regulating the domestic market as a way to do that. And so the domestic market ended up being included. Cameroon and Ghana both said, in order for the EUTR to move forward, we need to include the domestic market. And so that kind of just made the whole thing explode a little bit, where the EU was like, well, we're really only interested in what's being imported to our country or to our jurisdiction. But does anybody else hear that?
Yeah, so you have to switch on one of these lights. It's for one, yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So that was kind of the unionization. It's like, give us, you know, and that resulted in this boom of capacity building and training, and how can we formalize the informal market that's only timber circulating domestically, and so in that way, Cameroon and Ghana, you know, they really benefited a lot from the technology transfer and huge investments in trying to formalize the sector, which didn't work in the end anyway. But I think Cameroon and Ghana probably got quite a bit out of it, maybe more out of it than they would have if it was only focused on exports. Yeah.
Back with your paper. Okay, it's hot there, then Manuel.
Thank you so much for fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask, building on the Europeanization, external Europeanization that you talked about,
Yeah.
I was thinking, like Europeanization usually is understood as the integration of Europeanization of the neighboring countries of the EU. So that comes with other types of benefits as well. It's not necessarily just a commercial transaction or something that has an economic dimension, but it's also a promise of being part of a community, being part of a setting, a different type of being European. But that's not the case of the African countries that are involved in that. So I wonder whether this type of Europeanization that's only based on market transactions, and how effective can it be really if we keep on considering this only as an economical factor, and how can we really consider it as a Europeanization?
That's really interesting, and I don't know if I should philosophize or because I do think that there is a similar wish, not for everyone, and you know, I cannot generalize for the African population, but it just reminds me of some of the history of like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, which had, well, that was Belgium colonialism, but like Cameroon, yeah, Côte d'Ivoire, the French model of colonialism was very different from the British. It was based on this idea of évoluer, that you would become a French citizen potentially, eventually, which happened extremely rarely, but enough that Africans who were colonized still had this aspiration, like, oh, maybe I will get my French passport if I, you know, do this and that and this and that and comply with the colonizer. And anyway, so I think it's crazy in many of these countries when you realize, when you know a little bit of the history and then recognize how the European languages are still number one, right? I mean, not everywhere. Ethiopia, for example, is a major exception, but you know, like they still all want to go to Paris, right? They all want to do their shopping in Paris, and it's like there's still this, I think, aspiration to be more European. Not for everyone, and I'm generalizing a lot, and I probably should stop recording, but you kind of know what I mean, right? Like, I think it's still very strongly there to become part of the European culture and model, and yeah.
So we go to Manuel and then we go to Maria, who's online. Manuel.
Yeah, so I just on this point, I think that, you know, the whole idea of Europeanization and the fact that if you have the neighboring countries, for instance, that's a process whereby the parent thinks that Morocco, I did research in Morocco quite a bit, and I've never published on it, but I have a network of contact of organized things there, some of the institutes and conferences and stuff. You sense that it's a kind of a give and take, but there is a willingness. Like there is, like you have, for instance, beans,
of law who are really interested in the organization of the legal system for different what reasons, for instance,
Right.
for democratic reasons,
Yeah.
for gender issues, or the involvement of, for instance, the right of women to vote in local elections, things like this, right? So you have all of this. But I would still defend that Europe has used regulatory powers through trade to actually create alignments, policy alignments, that, some people see as a form of colonization from, and so for instance, in the security area, for instance, with regard to borders and immigration issues, you kind of sense that this is taking place beyond Morocco, it's having an impact on Mauritania, it's having an impact on Chad, it's having an impact on Mali, and so on. And so that's kind of one way to approach this array. But my question was much more specific to the talk, and I also wanted to say thank you. I think it's a fabulous talk. It's so well prepared and so detailed. At one point, you used coercion, conditionality, socialization, and persuasion. And these are things that I'm interested in because I've been looking at ways to categorize forms of cross-border collaboration, cooperation, coordination, and so on and so forth. And there is huge research in management around different ways of organizing. So I wanted to ask you specifically, where did these four parameters come from? And, where did you discuss, where are they discussed more in detail? Because they basically organize this, what you're studying. You're looking at categorizing countries and different forms of trade according to the regulatory system. So I think that's a very specific question, right? Really important. So that's then as part of this you discuss a country level, but so we already had the answer that it's way more complex, and so we don't need to go there. But in the talk, we talk about the country level, and I was wondering, is it just happening at the country level? Is that something that, but more importantly to me is like, how is that enforced? Right, so how do we go from coercion to persuasion, and are there mechanisms of enforcement that kind of follow? Sorry, it's very specific.
No,
it's because it's methodology.
yeah.
And I really like it, and I just, it's like, figured all kind of questions for my own interest across borders that we
Well, the exciting thing about this paper is I can share it with you, and we have a ton of references on Europeanization. So I did not come up with, I'm not sharing anymore. I did not come up with those. I did not come up with these 4 pathways. And there's a lot of, including my co-author on the paper, there's a lot of sources for where we got that. In terms of the mechanisms, I think it's really context specific. So there's a lot I didn't say about this timber regulation process. And actually the European Union ended up entering into a voluntary partnership agreement with timber exporting countries. So you have this big EU bloc on the one hand, and then you have individual countries at the other hand who are voluntarily entering a trade agreement. They actually don't have a choice. If they want to continue exporting to,
So in the immigration process, I have a colleague who traced the number of agreements just to give you a sense. The EU, since its creation, produced more than 2,500 pieces of legislation to control immigration into the EU. And most of this has to do about the same process.
Agreements with different.
It's like you have the EU bloc, and then each country, and sometimes even sectors within a country. It's kind of, so it's fascinating when we look at that, right? It's like the power of a big bureaucracy when it starts working on like piecemeal policy proposals across a very vast region. We're talking 50 or more states. When you look at the IPM, integrated management agreement, integrated management border agreement, you have 86 countries in the world that are concerned. And that is all coming out of the EU. Should support, you could have given the rule with somebody who's documented within.
Okay,
Right, so Canada is in it, the US is in it.
yeah.
Different provinces of Canada, have different kind of agreements.
Mhm.
A big reason to connect us to.
Yeah, I love that.
I've looked at this.
Yeah,
Thank you so
I'll
much.
send it to you, yeah.
Maria, thank you for joining us. You had a question. Do you want to pose it yourself by switching on your camera, or should I read it?
Sure, I've just,
Yeah, hi.
there's a little bit of a funny echo, so if I stop, Oliver, I'll just get you to take over. So Sophia, first, thank you for a very interesting talk. I wish I was in the room to have some chocolate with you all, but instead I am sipping some coffee or I was sipping some coffee during the presentation, so I feel like I was at least participating in some of the experiential learning part. Sophia, you provide or kind of hint at a number of critiques with regard to current trends around regulation, lack of involvement from small scale cocoa farmers, the potential of legislation having a kind of colonial impact, problems in terms of enforcement, and you seem to point to a few others. But at the same time, your talk clearly acknowledges the huge problem with deforestation. What I didn't get a sense from what I didn't get a sense in terms of your talk is what you think would be better options, better options in terms of regulation, protection for forests. Is it that you're hinting that Bill C-262 is a better option, so due diligence legislation, or, and if so, are small scale farmers more, is that approach more open to kind of involvement from small scale farmers, or what are you seeing is an alternative to the current kind of regulatory pushes that I absolutely agree with you in terms of those, the direction we're going. What do you see then as alternatives, if I'm hearing you right, in terms of some of your critiques and worries of the current process and current regulatory push we can follow?
Thanks, Marlia. Excellent question. And I think we should ask the same question to Constance McDermott, who's the Distinguished Women Scholar coming in a few weeks. She's based at Oxford and we're doing a lot of work together. And I think she has a different opinion than I do. But my personal opinion is, I think that the EUDR is a welcome change in the sense that what we saw with the timber regulation was, to answer Emmanuel's question, it was a government to government, state to state agreement. And yes, the Ministry of Forests, like from a sectoral approach, yeah, was the president of Cameroon signing? No, it was the minister. But what the EUDR, the deforestation regulation, does differently is start to hold corporations accountable. And the corporations were really left out of the timber regulation, except, the importers, those who place timber for the first time in the EU market. Yes, they're corporations, but a lot of it was between government to government, especially the negotiations. And if we can start to require companies to invest in their supply chains, I think we can have a little bit of movement towards more equitable profit sharing. And, the type of farming practices that are regenerative, kind of a buzzword these days, but regenerative farming, agroecology, this is all very possible through cocoa, which is, I'm gonna get to that. I think I have some slides on that, but I can talk about how there's a lot of potential with this tree crop to be integrated into a diverse farming system that is much more sustainable, especially in the long term, while providing diverse income streams for farmers. And so if we were to have corporations, those three big guys, right, where the profit is concentrated, actually truly invest in the farms that they're sourcing from, I think we could really have some movement. And, you know, the money is there, arguably. Maybe it's not there from the producer countries, maybe the EU doesn't have it, but corporations, I think there's a lot that can be done with requiring them to invest and holding them accountable for making those investments. Yes, it will be very expensive to restore that forest land. We will never get that forest land back in Côte d'Ivoire, right? It will never be what it was. It's just like old growth forests here, right? These are huge trees. You can't just replant, even though people are doing it. But the kinds of trees that they're replanting are not the same. It will take hundreds of years. But anyway, there's a lot that can be done, right? We won't be able to restore the old growth rainforest, but we will be able to do something that's much more sustainable. And I think that the knowledge is there, the technologies are there, the capacity is there. We just have to do it right and make the corporations go out and do plot specific analysis of how can we regenerate this cocoa farm. Wow. Scary.
Wow.
Or something. Yeah.
Can I comment on this?
Yeah, sure.
So, what you just discussed is something that was discussed in several regional conferences years ago, I could have that interview with it was the Director General and the Director General, the Director General at the time of Commissioner. And it was discussed about Spain, which I thought was amazing. Spain has this huge plateau at the center of Spain, which has been farmed for generations. And there's no more water, or much less water. So the only thing was, is the EU going to provide subsidies so that people who own the land can grow a forest? Because the people have the history. And they were white papers done on the phone. I haven't followed, but I thought that was extraordinary to think that, you know, a country that was basically entering into a very arid, because the EU was tracing the progression of climate change across those countries, across Italy, Spain, Portugal, and the south of France, and so on and so forth. And they were saying, you know, some infrastructures could be like burying water. So it's like you dig and you put the water in the ground. You don't, like, because traditionally in Spain, it's done that you just open the water and the water goes in the field, right? Especially in the southern part and down in the places. And so one of the things that we were discussing is, you know, can we use other mechanisms to pipe and bury, but also rebuild the forests that already existed. So they are also policy choices right now. And the contractual part, I think is really, really interesting. I do think it's a form of colonization. I don't know if it's a form of colonization, but certainly colonization and regulations across the board. It's a big deal. Interesting.
That's great. Thank you, Maria, and also Misha and Noor for joining us. Yeah, you can feel that there's some excitement building in this room that, you know, focused on chocolate tasting. So we can transition over soonish. Anyone, last question, open. So two more questions, maybe we collect those and then we go to the table.
No, then we'll go. Mine's more like a soft, kind of, which is, if you think about a governance, like so let me start with saying, I really appreciate it. Really interesting. It's sort of an interesting way to think about many problems I think about from a totally different angle. I agree, well put together argument, but I guess I want to challenge one component to this. Is it, I don't know, normal, not the right word, but is it inevitable that when we enter into relations with others, that we're gonna, in essence, export some of our values and some of our priorities? And so, like we do this with our neighbors and our relations, we do this country to country. And so, I guess I'm not surprised at all to hear that the European Union has a set of values. Some of it will line their own pockets, of course. Well, so I'm a sort of political economist in my heart, so I always follow the money. But the values around sustainability or the way we deem sustainability, imperfect mechanism, the legal tool, But inevitable, all our kinds of relations like that are gonna do that. We're gonna import or export these ideas. And we're gonna say, well, it's up to you. If you don't wanna trade with us,
Yeah.
you don't like our values,
Mhm.
fill your boots elsewhere. Now, I know that the very imperfect, that's very naive kind of way, but what's wrong with that?
Mhm.
Especially when we think, I mean, your first 3 slides were pretty compelling. Deforestation, big fat problem.
Mhm.
Sure, we could regrow it all in our own backyards, but we could also make sure no more bad stuff happens there.
Mhm.
So maybe if you can just kind of give me a sense of why we should be concerned about this, because I could see if we tip over into some kind of manipulation that's bad by
Mhm.
exporting sustainability values and keeping forests. There's many people in these places, I'm sure, who would love to keep the forests in place. They have no political power, can't do it. So they covet this kind of unholy alliance.
Mhm.
That's just a philosophical thing that pops in my mind.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I think it's important to recognize that this aspiration is wonderful. And I think everyone working on the EUDR agrees with you that, yes, we want to export these values. There are values. We want to save the last forests. We want to regenerate land. I think the devil is in the implementation details, where despite these beautiful, very compelling ambitions, how are we seeing this play out in practice? And what are the implications of how that's playing out? What we're seeing is exactly right on what Ted said, where the money is going towards consultants, going towards, producing these due diligence reports that are basically, polygons, and the money is not going to where it should be going, which is the farmers, in my opinion, where it's actually, yes, it's a very laudable aims, but how are we achieving those aims? Because I think we all agree we want this to happen, but it's just about, what has actually changed here? What has actually happened? And we're seeing that despite these nose-bleeding prices in the cocoa market, farmers are not making more for their beans. Farmers are not, and this is really complicated because it's mostly forward contracts, governments dictate a lot of that. So next year we'll probably see a higher price, but who knows? The money that's, going to the corporations, the money, how can we channel that to areas that need it most? I think what we're seeing, and this very often occurs in these sustainability aims or these sustainability policies, is the powerful become more powerful and become more opaque. And we're trying to have more transparency, but what is actually happening with those due diligence reports, and who can understand what's underlying those reports? Very few people that have very extreme expertise in the technologies, right? And
So now you really intrigue me, because to me, this is the now. And so the question, and maybe, let us mingle after, but is it incompetence, meaning poorly designed system, not enough accountability, not enough effective governance? Or is it nefarious, let's say, and say that because a powerful subgroup knows how to access further capital or further rents, and they're just rent seeking? And I think from a governance perspective, if we knew which one it was, you could kind of hammer it.
yeah,
But if we don't, and I think you have the expertise, you could kind of, I really think it makes sense.
doing a political economy analysis, I think, would be really important prior to some kind of regulation.
If you recall, when we were looking at intermediaries,
Mhm.
there's been a huge concentration, capital concentration in the intermediaries.
Mhm.
They are a big part of this puzzle
Yeah.
in terms of who's getting what
Mhm.
and the political economy of the supply chains.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, for sure. I have a whole research project on that. But I also think that the traders, these intermediaries, are also in some ways the ticket to sustainability. Because those are the only ones who actually have any clue about the supply chain. They're the only ones who are actually,
But there's no incentive.
yeah, what is their
There's no
incentive? Yeah.
incentive, that's the problem.
Mhm,
So you have to somehow create the incentive.
mhm, mhm.
Will be a constant because currently the supply chain law is being negotiated in the European Union. And
Yeah.
so see, where does the opposition come from? You're like, oh, it's too bureaucratic, we can't do this on the ground, so lobbyists are working hard. So it'll be interesting to see, where the power lies and who's involved.
Yeah.
Let's go for one more question.
This one's easy. Thank you so much for your talk. All of my research uses a lot of networks, and so I see a lot of networks and all of this. I was wondering what the work would sort of be a broader lab with Rachel being involved. If you're doing any network analysis of sort of the systems you're looking at.
I think that is part of Rachel's banting proposal, yes. She is social systems. There's this whole area of research that I'm being exposed to through her. You probably know much better about than I do.
We are like 1 degree of separation in terms of supervisor, so.
Oh, there you go. So yes, that is part of the plan. This is very preliminary with the Canadian system, and that will eventually be the plan, but it's difficult to collect data on this. Claire and I have been talking to some folks that are doing work on the labor, the supply chain laws, and they're like, you need a lot of money and connections with the lobbying organizations, otherwise, yeah. So, trying to figure out how can we answer the research questions that we have.
Well, this is one of the reason that corporations have been so under-theorized, is because it's very, very hard to get reliable data on what they're actually doing. You just get their public face.
Right.
So unless you can somehow get their business or whatever, it's really problematic.
Yeah.
The good discussion is an indication of the quality of the presentation. I think I put evidence of, how much he appreciated, your presentation today, and lots of common interests that, emerge, and I think maybe we can follow up with some of those or copy in all
Yeah.
ways.
Or chocolate.
So, yeah.
Right. So I brought a disproportionate amount of chocolate from Belize, because I don't know if you know that I was just in Belize like 2 weeks ago. Overreading me, I know that, but and I learned so much about the history of cacao. So it's very interesting. West Africa is cocoa. South America, Central America is cacao. Talking about the same thing. I mean, there's a lot more I can say about that, but in general, there's this regional distinction in the linguistics that I just find fascinating. So when I was in Belize, I met some beautiful farmers who, the indigenous Mayan culture, there's a few different groups of Mayan that are very present in Belize, which is not what you find in many other parts of the world. Like in many parts, the indigenous population has been completely wiped out. So it was fascinating to talk to the farmers about how cacao has a role not only in their language and history, but also their religion. So this Mayan hieroglyph is the etymology of cacao. Cacawa means our God. Ka means our, wa means God. And so you can just start to think about what the cacao tree signifies for these people. It's very holy. And you can contrast that to, oh no, I took it out. You can contrast that to Linnaeus botanical name, the colonial name, Theobroma cacao means food of the gods. Right? So what are we worshiping with that botanical name versus the indigenous, they're more worshiping the plant, the tree versus the product or food. So, sorry, that should say. Yeah, so Theobroma cacao is a botanical name for this tree that produces cocoa, and it was first domesticated around, this is research that just came out a few years ago, because we used to think that it was Mayan or Olmec, but actually it goes back much, much further. I'm not a historian, so I don't know the details, but 5,300 years predate the Olmec. And so, as we know, it's indigenous, this tree is native to this Central American part of the world, and it was exported to the African continent pre-colonialism, where we now see the geographic concentration of production in West Africa. Which, okay, so the red, sorry, the whole slide is on here, but the red produces cocoa production, the brown symbolizes consumption. So the areas where it is grown is not necessarily where it's produced. So this is the tree, and maybe we can always chocolate while we're, yeah. Yeah, okay. So this is the tree itself. It's a very interesting botany. It's called cauliflory, where it's a fruit tree, and the cauliflory is that the fruits grow on the stem, right? So that is quite unique. These are what the flowers look like. This is very, very zoomed in. The flowers are tiny, they're minuscule. Pollination is significant. Pollination is one of the reasons why cacao cannot grow outside of the tropics, because of midges and insects and different, mostly insects that are responsible for pollination. They just don't exist here. So we're eating the fruit of this tree. So these are the pods. On a good year, you can have hundreds of pods on one tree. When you open that pod, this is what the beans, the seeds of this tree look like. And this is the pulp, the white pulp. So this is a raw cocoa bean that has just been opened, and you can eat that. You can suck off the pulp, the white flesh. It tastes kind of like a lychee, very, very good. But the most for chocolate production, so for most of cocoa's history, it's been consumed as a drink. It's only in the last few hundred years that it started to be consumed as a solvent. And when you're making chocolate, the most important stage is the fermentation process, where about 5 to 7 days, these beans have to be fermented, and that fermentation process is actually what gives chocolate its flavor. So while I'm talking, we can pass this around. This is a very unique bar that you can say is wild cacao. This is from Bolivia. So these are cacao beans that come from trees that are very, very close resembling to like the wild, undomesticated species of cacao. So somebody went out into the Bolivian forest and was like harvesting to bring us this bar. So that's what I'm gonna say about that. There's a lot of that happening where I was in Belize, but the the criollo that they have there is actually already some kind of domestication. So these are even more wilder than a lot of the wild beans that you find.
Sophia, can we
Yeah,
find out from before, just while people are tasting?
Yeah.
Get it on their tongue and like.
yeah, so while you're tasting, let it melt on your tongue.
So the teeth are supposed to touch.
Yeah, so try to let it melt, try to chew, and see what you taste. There's multiple melting points, so, try to see, you know, how long it takes to melt and, what comes up for you throughout the process. Did everybody get one?
Can I ask a question? What's the percentage of sugar in this one? Oh, sorry, of cocoa?
It's really easy to know the percentage of sugar because, if you have 75%, for example, the 25% is usually sugar.
Right, so what's the percentage?
I think 70.
So,
Yeah, so I chose bars. Generally for tasting, it's good to do kind of similar, a cacao percentage. So what I brought for you guys today is, a bunch of 70s. We have 182,
what's it worth?
70 is 75, so that one's a 70.
Yeah,
70, and it shows you 20% sugar.
20%.
20%, yeah.
so 35%. So how did you obtain Bolivian chocolate in Belize? Was that,
No, I bought this at the chocolate project.
was that?
This is
This is surprisingly.
That's in China.
Such a high level.
Oh, is it on fourth? This is the one. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think about the taste? You don't know about the chocolate project?
No.
We have to change that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for selecting me, the volunteers.
They're based downtown, and you know where the atrium is? It's like near this Italian restaurant.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, like
down there. Oh, that is-
The Danbury, yeah. Habitat Coffee. This is where I got all this chocolate.
Oh, I thought you got, it's a Belize.
No, you cannot buy chocolate like this in Belize.
No.
You can buy chocolate in Belize, but I hate to say it probably won't be the same quality.
Because they export all the.
Yeah, they export the
And it's the same.
Yeah. I think Costa Rica is.
They have kind of the dull way company.
This is the big bag.
Ethiopia, yeah. It's the same.
You know, when they get bananas packets outside.
Well, tasting Venezuelan. This is again, very, very special beans, as you can imagine, with the situation in Venezuela, is not easy to, export, so everyone's excited about it. It used to be like that, quite rare.
It's funny because I went to see the Wonka chocolate movie with the kids. I keep thinking about, the Oompa Loompa song because they stole
Yeah.
the last cocoa beans from the tree and, so I don't know if you've seen it. with
I
your
need to
daughter,
watch it,
But it's amazing and the soundtrack is great. The kids
and it's not scary.
no,
Okay,
my daughter is 5 and
My daughter's
it's fine and, yeah, and we
it's
keep
very scary.
singing the songs and she's dancing and she's like, Oompa Loompa. So, but I would be interested to hear your take on this.
Yeah.
Could be a story.
Yeah. So another thing you can do is smell the bar before tasting.
I wish I had the whole bar to smell.
Can you tell great differences between the smells? You as an
Between the
expert?
Smell, my palate is not as refined. as many people, so the owner of the chocolate project, which is where I got this, he is a global judge. Or if you might notice sometimes like this award for the chocolate, so he's one of the globally renowned judges for these types of awards. And it's kind of similar to wine, right? Like there's this whole, I don't want to say hobby, but it's kind of like this blind wine tasting, and somebody with their palate is able to tell you which grape from where, maybe even which vintage. And it's similar with chocolate. Like they will be able to tell you percentage, where the beans are from. I can tell the difference between, we're gonna taste Madagascar, and Hawaii, I also find extremely unique. They're like, but you know, my palate is.
Well, so how do growers decide which to grow? Is just whatever they had around, the neighbors, they plant that same tree? Or do they actually like get high production, high yield plants, and they plant those? Or is it just the big producers that do that? Or, I mean, how did Ghana versus Madagascar, right, or Venezuela? Is it the plant that's different that we're tasting, or is it the soil and humidity, whatever?
Yeah, it's, a lot of it is this idea of terroir. And a lot of it, I mean, this is kind of a movement, right? The single origin chocolate. What you see on these packages is origin, country, maybe even farm. What you don't see is sustainability labels, Rainforest Alliance, U2Z. You very rarely see organic, even though I'm pretty sure that this Bolivian bar would qualify as organic. You can probably go beyond a lot of organic standards. You know, you don't see fair trade. But a lot of these bars would go above and beyond the fair trade minimum. So to answer your question, well, I guess your question was about how the trees get around, but it really depends on where.
Well, you get
So,
bamboo
like,
and
for
you get,
example, in Ghana, the government has a huge program, they're giving out seedlings. And the type of seedlings that they're giving out are mostly forastero, which is a high volume, low taste varietal. The varietals that maybe have a more delicate flavor, which we're gonna be tasting, but I think this Venezuelan, can I see the package? I think this Venezuelan might be a different bean. The second one is very different than the first one. Yeah. Good difference.
Where we had the presentation, I was thinking of tea, it's the fermentation that is crucial.
Yeah.
So you impose that, some of your, all these little farmers being the stuff that ferment, you don't know what's in there, right? So the fermentation is crucial. It's very long.
see, okay.
So, yeah, and you know, people will say there's a reason why we don't have Côte d'Ivoire as, if you go to the chocolate project, even though Côte d'Ivoire produces like almost 50%, but Côte d'Ivoire not find a bar from that country. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some people say it's because it doesn't taste as good. But I think it's mainly because the government so highly regulates the export that it's impossible. Sorry, I have to go teach you. You have much. It's impossible to have like a direct trade relationship. It all has to go through these.
It's very different, it has an amazing terms.
Yeah, the letterpress.
Yeah, the letterpress is very big. It just it's longer than the city. Cool, eh?
I think it's very interesting. Probably in Belize. No, that was a-
Yeah. Oh, nice, eh?
Right.
There.
See,
It's just like there, it's like,
I see, it's a bird. But
it's an airplane.
airplane.
Yeah, but it's also similar to wine, and said, the good quality you need to be about it. When we had this presentation, you asked them, what should a proper bar chocolate cost, but it was organically evolved or fairly produced, and not, yeah, this $12 per bar, and it's such a, so that, you know, gives you a sense of chocolate is compared to the Nestle, but, you know, it's.
You said that?
I think most of $12 from getting,
Very good shopping. Yeah, it's supposed to cost $12. Sorry?
This tasting is made from beans. So the company is based, I think it's Australia, or is it New Zealand, Calgary? Is it Australia or New Zealand? But the beans come from Vanuatu. Which is,
yeah, and you're getting excited about it because it's. Oh.
So Vanuatu is a Pacific island nation, close to Fiji, close to New Caledonia. They have a very tiny minuscule amount of cacao being produced there. But we're doing research right now on the stories that are being told about Vanuatu cacao. And whether there's kind of this movement now to have more chocolate production based at origin. So I saw this a lot when I was in Côte d'Ivoire. I see that a lot when I was in Belize. There's a lot of companies that are small companies starting to make chocolate very close to where the beans are grown. And so we're curious about, you know, the stories that are being told, but we're also curious about whether there's a difference between domestic and international. Next one is Tanzania,
It's too much.
yeah, there's a lot of bars, so I want to take smaller pieces,
Give back.
very small pieces, because we have a lot of bars coming, and there's some very exciting ones. This is the. Yeah.
Baby, or, you know, yeah, I'm one of my favorite types. Any problem, little, what's not the other ones?
What do you do?
I love it.
Yeah. The French places was my favorite, the
Yeah.
Has the stronger smell, aroma, or what do you call it?
Yeah, the first one is really good. That was, yeah.
There's a bit for me both here. The bitterness of Falkland remains long after the sweetness of low price. Passive aggressive, I don't know.
So the Tanzanian bar, the way this one works, there's a central fermentation. So farmers will sell wet beans with all the pulp on it. So once you harvest your pod, you can keep those pods for like a week. They put them on the ground, create a pile like that. Gave the beans just a week ago. Maybe. And then once you crack those open and remove the beans, you have 24 hours until you can get them into the fermentation.
What's already, how long, what?
So once you open these pods, you have 24 hours until, you know, till they don't go off. So you have to start the fermentation within. And it's fascinating because most places in Africa, the farmer does the fermentation itself, themselves, excuse me, using like banana leaves. Very, very small fermentation happening in the jungle, happening in the forest, on the farm. And so when you start to move towards higher quality, like this Tanzania bar that we're tasting, since we know fermenting is huge influence on the flavor, the central fermentaries start to have much closer management and regulation of the temperature. Sometimes they, control what's added. They really control how many times it's moved around, how much oxygen exposure that fermentation process has. All of that plays a huge role in the taste of chocolate. So what do you guys think about Tanzania?
Is that Tanzania the one with the print on it?
Yes, the letterpress.
That one is my favorite.
I think it's my favorite too.
Oh, really?
It's my favorite too.
I gotta try it.
It's a box.
Show it. So where she fixed it,
So this one is.
like,
The one that just went by. Yeah.
really? Okay. Okay, good.
The one.
Lot of butter, no, cocoa butter in this, rather
So-
more cocoa butter?
Often, if you taste, the mouthfeel is really like how smooth, how easy does it melt?
Much more smooth.
Very often. You will see, this is cocoa bean, organic sugar, cocoa butter. That would be what you like about it. It's so much.
You're always butter.
It's French now.
Yeah. So much of, it's not a bad thing. But it's. See this next one, that's basically, second one was tried. It only has cacao and sugar. So there's no extra butter. And the third one is the Vanuatu. You wanna pass it over?
Okay, good. I think I have to go with that.
This is better.
Is that your favorite so far?
Yeah.
What do you think? Century, maybe that's why we like it so much. It was really fascinating in Belize to watch the buying process.
Mm.
I've never seen wet beans be sold before, and it was fascinating because the farmers put the beans in plastic bags so the juice stays in there. And at the very last minute, they put all their beans into these what's the name of the cloth that?
Cheesecloth.
No, it's not cheesecloth, it's like these huge bags, right? Burlap. Yeah, burlap, that must be it. Like whatever these bags are made out of. So at the last minute, they put the wet beans into there and you can feel the juice starting to seep out. So they're trying to maximize the weight, they're trying to maximize how much money they get from the beans. Right, and so in Belize, they pay for wet bean. And by the time you get through the whole fermentation drying process, your bean ends up looking like this. It loses about 2/3 of the weight. So, but they have negotiated a wet price, so, but it's just interesting that in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, it would be such a huge setup to have central fermentation. I think the amount of beans that will be moving through there would be so much, it would almost be impossible, but.
What would be the advantage of
We
doing
need to,
that?
we need to keep
Wet.
moving, don't we? Okay. So what we're gonna do now is, we are going to taste 3 bars, all from Belize, all from Maya Mountain Cacao, which is where I just was. And can you notice about this picture that's similar to this? I brought this bar down there and had these. They're not the people in this picture that are not actually the farmers. These are the people who work for the trading company that is a central fermentary. So, even these guys who have a stable job, who, are happy to not have to do the manual labor on the farm, they rarely taste chocolate. And they were so excited to get this bar. This is standout. This is a Swedish company that does some amazing work in their chocolate. This bar, I think this one is Canadian. Yeah. This one, Uxbridge, does anybody know where that is? Yeah, okay, so this is a Canadian company, same bean. So let's not. I would love to see if you guys taste the difference. And then the third that we're tasting is Zata. Has anybody heard of Zata? No. This is an Austrian company based just like an hour from my mother-in-law. And they have, if you're ever in Austria, I highly recommend going for a visit.
Oh, I know it's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my, it's amazing. So this bar is famous for its carbon neutrality because it is shipped on a sailboat from Belize.
Seriously?
Yeah,
How much does that
so
cost?
every year, there's like, okay, be ready for the boat.
Wait a minute, we learned supply chains aren't that important for.
Get this, so please keep this, are we still recording? Yeah, so get this,